Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Geoffrey Van Orden. I'm the president of New Direction, the Foundation for European Reform. I'm delighted to welcome you to this one of our series of lectures. And I have to say that over the last couple of months, New Direction has sort of blazed a trail in Brussels with its series of very stimulating lectures. If we go back, of course, our no to the EU tax campaign, we shouldn't forget that. Professor Paul Reynolds, who spoke to us about the strengths and weaknesses of the European economies a few months ago. Johan van Overtveld, who talked about the end of the euro, and that was in September. 21st of September, we had Professor Marcus Kerber, who was with us again yesterday, in fact, really talking about reshaping the Eurozone. And on the 30th of November, of course, we had Saul Singer from Israel talking to us about business startups and business innovation, really the other end of the spectrum. We know what's going wrong, or some of what's going wrong. What do we do about putting it right? And how do we start growing our economies? And that was a very useful lecture. And tonight, of course, we have yet another very stimulating speaker. And I'm going to hand over to my Vice President, Dirk-Jan Epping, who will introduce the speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Last year in the plenary in Strasbourg, I got the floor and I thought, I'm going to surprise everybody with a book. And I took the book, Rettet unser Geld, Save Our Money, and I showed it in the plenary, and I said to everybody present, and there were not that many present, by the way, but one of them was the president of the European Socialists, Mr. Schulz. And I said, Mr. Schulz, this is particularly important for you. And he looked up with a bit of an aggressive look he has normally, and then he started ranting at me, saying, what a nonsense are you bringing to this floor? Rettet unser Geld. The euro is the safest and the best currency we ever had. It is a shield of protection against manipulators and speculators. You better do something else during Christmas than read the book of Mr. Henkel. And then I thought, I have to contact Mr. Henkel and invite him to give a speech. And it took some time, and I was reading and rereading the book. And actually, as things evolved, things are happening which we never expected to happen. Actually, in September, we were talking about scenarios of the end of the euro, and it was the first time, actually, this was ever discussed in the European Parliament. And everybody looked astonished, because this question is simply never raised. Now, we're always talking about the euro, what is going to happen to the euro. We always have a new summit to save the euro. I think tomorrow is already the 15th summit to save the euro. Big expectations, and then a few days later, the markets kill it off again, and we start all over again. We have the couple Merkozy in between, is going to save it and do all the work. But what we actually haven't been doing over the past year is to think of alternatives. Now, what is going to happen? What can we do, and how should we do it? And I think that's was one of the reasons to invite Professor Henkel here, who is a former president of the Federation of German Industry, Bundesverband der Deutschen Industrie, and whose book has been prominently discussed in Germany. And it is about time to come to Brussels and discuss it here, because everybody is still in the belief of the ever closer union and seeing the euro as the tool to bring it about. And now the opposite is happening, and very few people realize that the problem is in the euro rather than outside of the euro. It's not the Americans, it's not the Chinese, it is us, ourselves, that have created it. And therefore I would like to give the floor to Mr. Henkel to talk about the alternatives, because that is what we need to do now, and that is what New Direction wants to promote here in Brussels. Another voice. To you, Mr. Henkel.
Yeah, thank you very much for your kind invitation. Let me say in the beginning a few things. First of all, I am not a politician. Some people may not know that. And as you later listen to my speech, you will probably know why I'm not a politician. Number two, I would like to make a confession. The confession is that I was, when the euro was discussed in Germany and elsewhere, a strong supporter of the common currency. I thought it was a great idea and fought for it. And as I was reminded a couple of minutes ago, in 1995, I even went to President Santerre and argued a little with him because at that time I wasn't so sure. But I went home and discussed with some German professors, those professors, by the way, who later went to the Constitutional Court trying to stop this thing. And I went to Professor Starbatti at the University of Tübingen. This must have been in 1996, 97, and I asked him, why are you against the euro? And he gave me all the reasons, and I really left his office not knowing whether I did support the right thing. But then something happened. The secretary of the then finance minister of Germany, Herr Weigel, organized an additional clause in the later Maastricht Agreement, and this was the famous no bailout clause. And the no bailout clause was for me the firewall between the German taxpayer and his children and the politicians in other countries. And at that moment I said, no risk, I'm in favor of the euro. Well, I have brought with me today a couple of questions which I would like to answer for you. And later I am willing, of course, to answer additional questions. For you, this has the advantage that you know where I am in my speech, and I know I am sort of in between you and the dinner. And for me, it has the advantage that I only have to pose those questions for which I have a reasonable confidence to have a good answer for. The first question is, why did I change my mind on the euro? The second question is, where will this course of action, which the politicians are obviously taking and have taken in the last 18 months or so, take us? And the third question will deal with the alternatives. Are there alternatives, and what would they be? And the fourth question I ask is, what are the pros and cons of the alternative which I propose? And the final question, the last one I would like to answer is, what does this all mean to Europe? Let me at the outset say that we are in the middle of a Greek tragedy. And this thing will end like all Greek tragedies end. It will end like a tragedy. But I think we need to make sure that we find the best way, because there are various possibilities for this tragedy to end. And I have not come here, I would like to make this point very clear from the very beginning. I have not come here with an easy solution. There is no easy solution out of this situation. There is none. Every solution, every scenario which I can think of is terrible, really. But I think we owe it to ourselves and our children to define those scenarios, discuss those alternatives, discuss the pros and cons, and then make a decision. This discussion is not taking place, certainly not in my country. There is no discussion on alternatives. And I'm grateful that you have invited me here to present it. I've done this on my own in Germany, organizing 3 major situations with 300 to 600 people coming every time. And each time I present this discussion, of course, or my proposals, of course, in German, I ask them a question. I ask them at the very beginning, who would be in favor of a northern euro consisting of Germany, Austria, Netherlands, and Finland? And each time I would say, let's say there are 400 people, 10, 20 hands get up. At the end of my discussion, I would say 80% of the hands go up, which means that if one has the time and the opportunity to discuss this, you can get rid of a lot of false ideas which you might have when you don't have the opportunity to discuss it. I'm frequently, or I was frequently, in talk shows and other similar discussions, and every time I try to table this proposal, I'm being silenced by some arguments like, well, if you continue to talk, I get out of the room. Or you must be a right-winger. Or you are not a real good European. Or worse, you risk war between Germany and France and things like this. So there's no real possibility to discuss this subject in Germany. Let me get to the first question. Why have I changed my mind? Well, first of all, one reason, I didn't know. I really didn't know, and I was naive that politicians would so blatantly violate those criteria and stability rules they promised us when we gave up the D-Mark. And let me say that I know very well that amongst the first violators were Germany and France. By the way, not because they themselves broke the 3% rule and then forced the European Commission not to put the sanctions into Germany and France. No, the first violation was to let Greece into the monetary union. And I'm grateful to the Süddeutsche Zeitung, who discovered some months ago that in 1997 or 1998, I forgot it, I publicly protested against Greece going into the monetary union. And I remember very well when, this must have been in 1999, when the first letters were published that Greece may not really have made it. The then Minister of Finance, Mr. Eichel, told me, Mr. Henkel, shut up. Number one, of course, the cradle of European democracy must be with the European Monetary Union from the very beginning. This was one argument. And the other argument, even, Mr. Henkel, if you're right, they constitute only 3% of the total monetary volumes of the euro, so they can't do really any harm. Well, anybody who skis, I still do, knows that a little snowball can create an avalanche. And of course, you know that this has happened. So a number of breaches were committed. You probably know the number, more than 60 times this contract was violated. Not once were disciplinary actions taken as foreseen in the contract. And I really lost my patience in May 2010 when Frau Merkel, at the pressure of the French president, tore down the firewall between the German taxpayers and politicians in southern countries, the no bailout clause. At that moment, I knew this thing would go wrong. The second reason why I changed my mind, I should have known, but I really ignored. Remember you of my discussion with Professor Starbatty. I had not really seen that a one-size-fits-all currency cannot really work when you have totally different cultures, economic, social, and financial and budgetary cultures, like we have in Europe, in the North and the South. And this one-size-fits-all currency has become a one-size-fits-none currency. It has turned out to be too weak for Germany and too strong for Greece. And let me give you 3 examples. The Greek politicians would have been unable to ever accumulate this enormous amount of debt had they had to pay Greek interest rates. In fact, the Greek budget never paid more interest in the last 12 to 15 years They kept the interest payments at the same level, but could almost triple the amount of debts for it. So you have here a wonderful and I think eloquent example that the euro is at fault. Second reason, remember the real estate bubble in Spain. It could not have developed with Spanish interest rates. It could only develop with the German interest rates. And of course, the Bank of Spain had no opportunity to intervene and stop this bubble. And the last argument and the last example, something I should have known too, because I remember very well in the 90s, the Italian industry, for instance, really was a formidable competitor to Germany. The machine tool industry became extremely competitive. Some of the German companies started to move their jobs and companies and plants to Italy. Why was Italy so competitive? Well, one reason was they continuously could adjust the value of their currency and could maintain competitiveness. They can't do this anymore in a single currency. So the entire South, including France, lost in competitiveness because slowly but surely the euro became too strong and they had no way to counteract it. Of course, you could make the point that they should have counteracted by reforms. But they never really did all the reforms. They always used a mix between reform and then stay alive with additional devaluation. So here you have the reasons. And the last reason is, and that's very obvious, becomes very obvious today, the euro has become a very dangerous way of getting infected. It was inconceivable before that if Greece had a cold, that Germany would sneeze, or that if Italy has the flu, that we would have to go to the doctor. But today it is very obvious that any problem amongst those 17 countries becomes a problem of the other 16 countries. So here you have the major reasons for why I changed my mind. Let me get to the second question. Where will this lead to? I don't want to fool you here, ladies and gentlemen. I never try to fool anybody. But I would like to differentiate between what I think should happen and what I think will happen. And I will now describe to you what I think will happen. And I may disappoint you, or some of you. I think the euro will stay for quite a while because these European politicians will save it at all cost, and literally at all cost. And I don't mean at all cost to the Germans, Austrians, Dutch, and Finns, but I mean even at the cost of a complete loss of competitiveness of the entire continent. They don't care. This thing must be saved. So at the outset, I would definitely believe they will never voluntarily give up the euro. While I will later describe to you an alternative, I want to make it clear I do not think my proposal has a lot of chances to materialize by political decisions. Maybe more by the result of a chaos as a result of this policy. But where will this lead to? Well, as you well know, we were promised a monetary union, and we are now very clearly already in a transfer union. I don't have to explain to most of you, I think, what it means if the European Central Bank has now purchased more than 200 billion euro worth of papers from the 5 PIIGS countries. I don't want to really pronounce this word in full. Otherwise, I will already be criticized for racism or whatever. But it is very clear, and from a German standpoint, we Germans are responsible, if something happens to those more than 200 billion, for at least 27%. Now I say at least because let's assume one country falls. Of course, we will take an additional percentage because the country which goes broke will not be able to participate in its own rescue. So theoretically, these 200 billion could fall on our feet almost all. Now, we are already in a transfer union, and for me it is very obvious the end result of this will be what? Will be inflation. The politicians in my country will, at the end of all of it, and I think most other Eurozone countries as well, see only two ways out of it. One is they go after the wealth which still exists internally in the country. Now, Germany has 2.1 billion worth of debts, but it has 1.2 billion worth of capital accumulated by private people. So, of course, here the opportunity for the politicians will be to get at that money. This is part of the solution, and therefore, for instance, Red Green has already decided in Germany not only to raise the taxes, including the solidarity contribution for East Germany above 50%, but also to re-establish a wealth tax and increase the inheritance tax. So this is one way. And the other one is, of course, inflation. Why do I believe in inflation? Why do I believe the inflation will be the result? Well, one again has to answer only two questions. One is who benefits from inflation? Of course, always the debtor, because it will be much easier for him to repay the debt at a lower exchange rate or money which is not worth as much as it was when he took the credit. And the second question is, who is the largest debtor? Well, the state. So the answer is very clearly, at the end of all this, we will lose definitely in two ways. We will tax the private people who still have money, and we will really get at the poor people, because those are the ones who suffer from inflation the most, because they have nothing but their income. So the outlook is rather bleak. But not only that, I believe that the system of a transfer union implies automatically a system of organized irresponsibility. We in Germany have quite an experience with that. It is called the Länderfinanzausgleich, by which in Germany, we have 16 Länder, as you know, there is a system in place by which one state helps the other. Now, it is so rotten already that we have only 3 Länder left who contribute and 13 who take. And if, for instance, Bavaria, which is a contributing state, saves €1, they have to give to the other 13 states 97 cents. And if Bremen, which is one of the countries which gets, one of the states which gets money from the pot, if Bremen spends €1, it gets back 97%. And this is the major reason for the indebtedness of my country. The state's indebtedness is the real problem in Germany, not the one of the federal government or the communities. And this system of organized irresponsibility has been a major contributor to the problems of the German finance. Now an army of politicians, financial experts and so on, have realized and have tried to change that system, because regardless of whether greens, reds, yellow or blacks, in Germany, I talk about political colors, regardless, they all believe the system is wrong and it should be changed. But it can't be changed because the 3 states who contribute are always outvoted by the 13 who get. Ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly the system into which we are now getting. And as a matter of fact, in the European Central Bank, we already have it working. You all heard why Herr Weber, Axel Weber, the president of the Bundesbank, left. He left because he was outvoted when he opposed the original purchases of government bonds from Portugal and Greece. And later, another excellent economist, the chief economist of the European Central Bank, Herr Stark, left also because he was outvoted when he opposed Trichet's idea to also buy those papers from Spain and Italy. So we are already in this system. It is already there, ladies and gentlemen. We are in this transfer union. We can't help it anymore. And if you look at the ESM, which is now up for vote early next year, and if you look at the way the voting is organized, there is already a big debate of whether you need a majority vote or whether there is a veto right for a country. Herr Schäuble goes around in Germany and assumes there is a veto right. This is not at all the case, ladies and gentlemen. So whatever happens, we are already in this system, which I consider a system of organized irresponsibility. At the end, and I try to answer this second question this way, at the end, the wealth of the Eurozone countries will be lower and will diminish. But it is more equally distributed. And maybe that's exactly what many people want. They don't much care about the absolute value or wealth. They are more interested in equalization. Now let me get to the third question. Alternatives. There are alternatives. Let me talk about three. One has been talked about in the last couple of weeks for the very first time, although it should have been talked about for months. As a matter of fact, the first person who suggested it was Frau Merkel herself. When the first Greek crisis happened in May 2010, her first reaction was, Greece must get out. And then she went to Brussels, was subjected to a presentation of Trichet, it's all well documented, was put under enormous pressure by Sarkozy and Zapatero. And some of you may know the story. It is definitely true and has been documented and published. It's also published in my books, and I have never been dragged to court to sort of blacken it out. Has been reported by Spanish politicians. Sarkozy threatened Mrs. Merkel, Frau Merkel, at that time, and he said, well, if you don't help Greece, we will go back to the French franc. This is not a rumor, this is a fact. And of course, this was a bluff. And she fell into the trap, and the rest is history. So what would it mean if Greece would leave the currency union today? Well, let me first get into what the politicians now decided. Originally, they said, of course, Greece will always be able to pay their credits back. Nobody ever dared to question Greece's ability to pay back in 100%. But now they have the idea that there should be a haircut of 50%. Now, as you see, I still have some hair. I was at the barber 4 weeks ago, and I think I have to go to the barber in another 2 weeks. The same will happen to Greece, ladies and gentlemen. Because this haircut of 50%, and even if you shave all the hair off, the Greeks, and forgo all the credits, doesn't make Greece more competitive. Not 1%. The textile factories in Athens and the wharfs in Piraeus and the hotels in Rhodos will not be cheaper. There have been more than 100 rescheduling of debts in the history of the world, and the most frequent and quite well-known ones were the ones in Argentina and Russia. But not in a single case has there been a rescheduling of debt without devaluation. This will not work. Greece has absolutely no chance to recover without devaluation. And if you look what happens to Greece today, you know that their economy shrinks, their unemployment grows, the number of companies goes down, and the tax base is going down. And the same is true already in their own prediction for next year. So Greece can never become competitive without devaluation. But in a single currency system, that is not possible. So at the moment, these politicians say, we are cutting 50% of the debts off, and now Greece will become more competitive. This is a ridiculous assumption. There is not a single economist whom I know who believes that there is a chance for Greece to ever be able to do this. By the way, not to the same extent. The same is true for Portugal, for Italy, for Spain, and, ladies and gentlemen, whether you like it or not, also for France. I've been living in France for 11 years. I still have a home in the Normandy, and I will say I know that this is not exactly a typical German modesty, which is of course an oxymoron. I realize that German modesty doesn't really go together, but I say it. I am also a commander of the Légion d'honneur, and so far the French haven't sort of ripped this off my jacket yet when I show up there. But France has the same problem. I don't know whether you realize that the new debt of France this year will be 4 times as high as Germany's. And the industry in France has lost dramatically in competitiveness. The euro is also too strong for France, and of course for Italy. So let me get back to the Greek scenario. Could we throw out Greece, or could we ask Greece to go, or could the Greeks themselves decide to go? You all know that if you want to do it in a legal way, Greece can't go and we can't kick Greece out. However, Greece could decide to leave the EU. They could do this and then a second later leave the Eurozone and then another second later go back to the EU. So one could sort of produce this result. But I am afraid that politicians who are afraid of doing this are right, because I have no idea how to control this. If this is the decision of Friday, let's assume, on Monday the Greeks will storm the banks. And not only the Greeks, I'm afraid. On Tuesday, the Portuguese. And maybe on Wednesday, the Italians. And on Thursday, the French. And on Friday, the Germans. So to kick out the Greeks or let them go is, in my view, an extreme risky enterprise. And I have full understanding for the politicians that they don't want to take that risk. I don't know of any economist who has thought this through in a way that you could organize it and manage it. Some people have talked about you need to have the army sort of blocking the border posts and have to make sure nobody can go leave the country and have to give out new money. But look, I don't know how to do this. And there's always this wonderful example of the omelette. You probably have heard that. You can make out of a couple of eggs an omelette, but it is very difficult to make eggs to recover the eggs from the omelette. So indeed, this is an extreme, difficult, and I would say dangerous scenario, and therefore I am not in favor of it. I have full sympathy with the politicians that this is risky. And by the way, who knows whether once you kick out Greece, then of course Portugal will probably have to go in the same way. Unorganized, chaotic, I'm afraid of it. Now, I'm not to say that this will not happen. It could happen. But I think we owe us a different alternative, an alternative which does not have all the disadvantages of the current course of action, and an alternative which doesn't present us with this enormous chaos which I just described. And that is the one I propose since about 15 months. And it sounds very odd. I have this experience always. People say, well, wait a minute, how is this possible? But let me quickly describe it. We leave the euro where it is. We don't kick out Greece. But the 4 countries, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, and Finland, leave and create a new currency. The working name for that is Northern Euro. Of course, this will never be the name. Could call it the guilder or whatever, or the crown. Now, when you do this, you will immediately have 2 effects, obvious effects. You will have a strong revaluation of this Northern Euro, and as compared to the euro for the remaining 13 countries, you will have a strong devaluation. Let me talk about the southern countries, or those countries remain in the euro first. Well, didn't I earlier establish that the euro was too strong for them? This devaluation will help them recover part of their competitiveness, something they have no chance of doing in a single currency. So here is the first example, the first advantage for those countries which are currently without growth perspective and without hope to ever reach competitiveness. It gives them that flexibility. They have their own European Central Bank, and if they want to have euro bonds, and they all want, they can have them. Now the other 4 countries will have their own their own central bank. Maybe the Bundesbank with a Finnish president on top or whatever. And this bank will organize together with the European Central Bank the exchange rate so that you don't have this gigantic difference to start with, and that you can organize it very much the same way as the Swiss Central Bank organizes currently their exchange rate vis-à-vis the euro. You will have other side effects. I had recently a meeting with 50 CEOs from Sweden. There were the representatives of the major Swedish companies at the invitation of the Swedish ambassador in Berlin. The 2 Wallenberg brothers were there. Professor Zinn from the IFO Institute gave first a talk, and then I gave a talk. He talked about the scenario which I tried to unfold for you, what will happen now, and he came up with enormous debts which the Germans might pile up as a result of all the credits, the collaterals, and so on, coming to almost 500 billion euro today for Germany. And then we had breakfast, and the Swedes said, "Oh Christ, we will never get into this euro." Well, Herr Zinn reminded them that they have to go. The contract of Maastricht and Lisbon says that a country which reaches the convergence criteria, the stability criteria, has to join the euro. Only 2 countries don't have to do this, the UK and Denmark. But Sweden has to. And Sweden makes all those criteria. Have you heard Barroso or Rompuy or anybody or Juncker going to the Swedes and saying, "Hey, you must come now. The contract provides for you to come"? No, he doesn't. They know why. Well, then I gave my speech very much like I give it to you today. And at lunch break, they said, "Mr. Henkel, if the Northern Euro came, Sweden would join tomorrow." And they said, and of course Denmark would too. And the feedback I get from Czechia is they would join it also. So paradoxically, at the end you will have in the European Union less currencies than today. Now, let me come back to my 2-tier system. Of course, eventually, but not in the year 2015 or 2020, I have nothing against that. Eventually, if once everybody has the same kind of disciplinary system in place and has proven over years that they are all following the same system, maybe one day we may have again a common euro. This could be, but Christ, not in the next 10 years. So what I'm going to say is you could have a flexible membership. And the first country, according to the statistics which we have when we developed this proposal, the first country to make the switch will probably be Ireland. Because Ireland did not suffer from the typical euro problem. Ireland suffered only, in quotes only, from a lousy banking administration by the government. And for me it was very interesting to see that the British government decided to save the euro in Ireland. Why should they? Well, because there were British banks. Very much like the Germans, when they saved or helped to save Greece, they didn't help to save Greece. They saved French banks. And that, by the way, is exactly the reason why Monsieur Sarkozy put such enormous pressure on Frau Merkel last May. Because it is the French banks who have the major problems in those countries, not the German banks. But it is, of course, rather attractive for a French politician to have somebody else participate in saving his own banks. Now, how would we do this? When you analyze this crisis, we have to admit that this really is a convergence of three different crises. Number one, we still have the long-term effects of the financial disaster of 2008, which means that we have banks in Europe which are very shaky. This is problem number one. Problem number two is, indeed, we have a problem of countries which have piled up too high debts. Schuldenkrise, we call it in Germany. Debt crisis of countries. Politicians admit number one and admit number two. And we have, I maintain, the euro crisis. You will remember the problems caused by the system itself. These problems are not acknowledged. They don't exist in the view of our Euromantics trying to solve the problem. Now, in my book, we have to separately address these three problems. And the first problem everybody has to accept or has to solve, regardless of which solution you want. Solution today, solution Greece out, or solution the Northern Euro. The first problem we have to solve is to stabilize the financial system in Europe. This is number one. And I should say, fortunately, the politicians have started to learn that. And as you may remember, the desire to increase the capital of European banks is part of this deal. But, ladies and gentlemen, that is not enough. And you hear from me a proposal which probably knocks some of the liberals off their shoes when I say this. And believe me, I'm a real believer in market-driven economies. But what this would really mean is the temporary nationalization of banks in Europe. If we don't do this, we are not going to solve this problem. By the way, Sweden has done this some years ago with great success. They have nationalized the banks when they had a problem and could resell them later as a profit. The savings and loan crisis in the United States 25 years ago happened the same way. Now, for my country, this would only mean a nationalization of one more bank, which is the Commerzbank. The Deutsche Bank has enough power to survive a rescheduling of debts, but the Commerzbank doesn't. I don't know whether you are aware that 2/3 of the German banking sector is already in state hands. But that's not the case in France. So in France, this would certainly require the nationalization of the French banks, which automatically means a huge increase of state debts by France. They would immediately lose their AAA rating. But it is the reality. This is exactly what already is in place. All these banks have papers in their vaults which are not that amount worth which is written on the papers. So this is the first step which has to take place. And the second step then is my proposal, coming up with two different currencies, and which is sort of a network. It's a pipe with an opportunity for countries which really manage to maintain a stability over time to get and move up, if you wish. And meanwhile, cause an opportunity to grow again. Now, let me talk about the negative aspects for the northern European countries. Devaluation. Of course there will be a devaluation, ladies and gentlemen. But it will not be like in Switzerland, because Germany, for instance, neither the Netherlands, Austria, or Finland are countries where Arabs, Germans, or other people are putting their money. Switzerland suffers from an unusual high revaluation because it is a haven for people who don't know where to put their money. And that's the main reason for the Swiss revaluation. If you look at examples, you better look at Sweden. Sweden, a non-euro country, has had regular revaluations against the euro, and they do very well. Meanwhile, I can say, at least for Germany, but I know it's also true for the other three countries in a way, 45% of all our exports are imported before. So first of all, we get a positive effect. So any scenario which sort of predicts a huge devaluation and a total loss of exports from northern countries is rubbish. And by the way, as I said, these two central banks can manage the way those revaluations, respectively devaluations, are taking place. Now let me get to the last question. Europe. For me, this is really a fundamental reason to look for an alternative. We are now running into a Vaterland Europa. And Charles de Gaulle has promised us an Europa der Vaterländer. In other words, rather than maintaining national identities, the Eurozone is supposed to be marching into a centralized body. And for me, this is a hilarious situation. As a byproduct of rescue packages for a currency, we are getting a centralized bureaucratic Europe. What a ridiculous policy. I can't understand even the most Euromantic European politicians that they accept that. And by the way, these are very often the same people who say we shouldn't really only look at financial or economic arguments when we make political decisions. But here we are forming a Europe as per the requirements of a currency. It should be the other way around. A monetary system should always reflect the culture of the nations, and the nations shouldn't be changed so they can reflect the requirements of a monetary union. And this is exactly what makes me really mad. And what is totally overlooked, ladies and gentlemen, is that the euro has become a problem. Now that the economic arguments for the euro are gone, politicians come up with political arguments. But they are evaporating. Have we not noticed that the arguments within the Eurozone are strengthening, are sort of exploding day by day? Germany was the most liked nation in Greece before the crisis, and we are now the most hated. And I spent 6 days in Greece, and by the way, a day and a half before in Turkey. By the way, Turkey and Greece started off from the same base when the euro came. You go to Turkey when you want to see a country which booms because it could manage its own currency. Now, I have seen a European flag, this wonderful blue flag, which is with its 12 stars organized in the form of a swastika in Athens. And for me, it's just amazing to see how the socialists in France are rediscovering, I would say, a vocabulary which I have never heard. I was born in the war and only know from history lessons how we were regarded by the French. And of course, it's a logical development. If Frau Merkel, as representative of the largest creditor in Europe, she has to tell everybody what to do. She is the creditor. And since she has to do this, also for internal consumption, vis-à-vis her own voters, this results in this enormous, I would say, problems of Germany in those countries. I don't know whether you heard that Frau Merkel has blasted the Spanish for having too many vacations. She has forgotten that the Germans, by the way, have more vacations than the Spanish. She was even wrong. And the finance minister Schäuble asked the Greeks to privatize companies of a sort which we in Germany don't privatize. And we are constantly lecturing other countries. It is the Germans who have said the Italians must save more money. Now, this is not our business to stick our nose into other people's countries. And if we continue to do so, we must not be surprised that we are unleashing some very anti-German feelings. So my thesis is, it's not a thesis, my observation is that the euro results in something just the opposite of what it was meant to be here. It creates additional rifts and it creates additional animosity, which we never had. This is the result of the euro. And not only within the Eurozone, even more disturbing to me is this increasing rift between the 10 countries which are not in the euro and those 17 which are. By the way, we have now new polls, which say that from those 10 countries, only the Romanians still would like to go into the Eurozone. Don't know whether that's exactly what we would like to have at this moment, but it is a fact. Now, the rift between the non-Euro countries and the Euro countries is widening. And I'm extremely disturbed by what's happened in the United Kingdom, where now a significant number of conservatives may even like to ask for a vote on whether they would like to stay in the European Union or not. This would not have happened without this chaos caused by the euro. I was myself 15 years ago or 12 years ago visiting the CBI and was campaigning for the CBI's support for the euro. And interestingly enough, they had a report at that time, and the CBI said the following: we will not make a position on whether we like the euro or not. But if the euro is there, we suggest we get in. Now, that position you would never get from the CBI again. Why not? Because of this chaos the euro has caused. And I already mentioned that the other countries don't want to go, like Sweden, Denmark, Poland, Czech Republic, and so on. So for me, the euro does not even achieve its political objectives. It disturbs them. It's counterproductive. And that for me is the strongest reason of looking at alternatives. Ladies and gentlemen, I have presented you with one. I do not know whether you like it or not, but it is at least an alternative. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Henkel has kindly agreed to take questions. Wilfred.
Mr. Henkel, that was a very, very interesting and well thought out speech. I start from the basis that one of your countrymen who was President of the European Parliament, Mr. Hensch, accused me of being a fascist when I took the view that you can't have the euro, and this is where I disagree with you, you can't have the euro without political and fiscal union. Therefore, the alternative that you put forward continues to run with the same crisis that we've got now. Even with the 4 or 5 that are stable, the problem will arise that who is going to guarantee the debts that are in those particular individual countries, because they are diverse themselves. And even worse with the other 12 that are so diverse that you would get into a situation whereby somebody has to give not an implicit guarantee, but an explicit guarantee. And I don't think anybody's going to do that. So my alternative, frankly, is it's got to end. The euro has got to come to an end. The individual member states that are in the euro have got to come out and develop their own currencies, as you've said, for Greece, devalue, make themselves more competitive, and get on with it.
Well, thank you. It's a very good question, of course. Let me go to the Northern Euro. I don't think there is a problem at all, because you may remember that before we went into the Euro, we had 15 years of the, we called it D-Mark block. That worked beautifully, with the exception for the UK, who, as you may remember, one fine day, I never forget that, on a Friday they said, we will forever stay there. And of course, on a Monday they were out. So the Northern, my philosophy is the different financial budgetary cultures, and that the Northern European countries have demonstrated that they can operate in a currency union without fiscal union, has been demonstrated for 15 years, and I think very successfully. Different, of course, in the South. You have a very excellent point. I have failed, of course, to mention, and there's no time, that we would never be able to get out of this without the consent of France, which means we would have to pay a large exit ticket. Normally, one pays big prices for entry tickets. This one would be a very expensive exit ticket. And but I am proposing that we pay it for 2 reasons. Number one, long term it will be cheaper. And number 2, some of the guarantees we gave are already gone. They are still being valued at 100% at the European Central Bank, but you and I know they are not worth. They may be worth 50% or 60%. So what I mean to say is we would help those countries, in particular Greece, but not only Greece, to get back on their feet. We need 20 billion euros to refinance the Greek banks. Then this problem is solved. So we give the Greeks 20 billion euro to get out. They can devalue. Their banking system is in shape or recovered, and it costs us some money. So, but the difference between, let's say, France and Greece is certainly bigger than between Germany and Finland. Here I agree. And to be quite frank, if that's what they then decide to do after these 4 go, that's their decision. I am only proposing ways out. To say everybody goes back to its own currency is, I think, a chaotic situation, as I mentioned. And let me also speak as a German, quite frankly. Even I don't dare in public in Germany to say, let us go back to the D-Mark. Immediately I will be a fascist. And I am already under severe criticism by my colleagues who like to export with their devalued euro. It's so easy for them. I'm under criticism by politicians and media people who try to push me into the right corner. It's very difficult for them because, and now I shock you probably also, I'm of the opinion that, and I always said that Turkey should be part of the European Union. However, not the kind of centralized European Union like we have it today. So I always use this argument to make sure they can't put me into the right-wing corner. But, you know, this is so crazy in my country. I cannot give such a speech without making, for 2 minutes, a long speech that I'm a devoted European. You cannot criticize the Euro policy without, this is crazy. I must always come up with a, how can I say, an epilogue. No? I love Europe, and then I can make my proposal, and then I must make a, then I must make the epilogue. The other one was a prologue. And I must make my epilogue and must repeat what I said. And by the way, I love Europe and I'm European. If you don't do this, you're immediately regarded a, fascist. True. But your question is right, right on the spot. Yes, please.
Professor Henkel, your suggestion of the euro, we are now based in Belgium, we do not include Belgium. How would you avoid a bank run that not all the Belgians transfer the money to the how the same as you would say you cannot barricade Greece, you cannot barricade the rest of Europe. So
Good question. That makes it very difficult. A is what the governments do. B is Greece out. C is me. Okay, good. Now on B this does happen. On C it wouldn't happen because you have your euro.
No, I would go out.
No, you wouldn't.
My money, I would bring my money to Holland.
No, you wouldn't. No, I don't think so. Let me try to explain why. And this very important part of the proposal. The Greeks, the Belgians, the Spanish, the French have no need. They have their euro. They get much higher interest rates from their banks. If you would like to change your money to the new euro, you can do this. You get no interest, hardly any. By the way, you can do this today. Why don't you bring your money to Switzerland? You haven't done that. Same thing. So some people bring their money to Switzerland because they're afraid that the euro may collapse or whatever. But if you do, you get no interest. Now, this opportunity to take your currency at lower interest rates to stronger countries or at higher interest rates to weaker countries, you always have. This is the beauty about this proposal. The euro stays where it is. And if you decide to take your money to Germany, you can do this. But maybe a lot of Germans bring their money to Belgium because they get higher interests. And as you well know, a lot of people from strong currency countries with low interests have done this for many years to gain higher interests. So this thing will be controlled by interest rates, and that's the task of the two central banks. So I don't think this is a problem.
Lady in front.
Yeah, a bit of a sidetrack. You said helping Greece the way we're helping Greece now is not going to make the country more competitive. What would you suggest then to be the right way to help Greece help itself?
Yes, well, three things. Number one, what they do today, they give them a haircut. That makes it easier for the government. By the way, after this haircut to which they have agreed, the Greek debt is higher than it was at the beginning of the crisis. So the haircut is not enough. But a haircut. Number two, the opportunity to devalue, which is the most important thing. If you go to Greece, and I spend there six days, as I said before, you have 3 latte macchiatos in a goddamn village in somewhere in the boondocks of Rhodos. You pay 10 euro. This is crazy, much too expensive. And the tourist industry in Turkey booms. Well, and the third thing is what the Greek government now does, reforms. So if the current new prime minister is able to get his reforms through, gets a relief on the debts, number two, and can devalue, I think this country has an excellent chance to recover. But if it is not allowed to devalue, it has no chance to recover.
Although is not a real root cause European policy.
Well,
The euro was used as a political instrument, not as a trading.
yes, yeah, I must remind you that I did say that we have three different causes for the problem. The financial crisis, the debt piled up by politicians, very much like in the US, and the euro. Now let me get to the US, which I'm grateful for the question. The US is a nation since more than 200 years, has one currency since more than 200 years, has 50 states, which, as you rightfully say, vary very much from developed and undeveloped and whatever. But no one in the United States would ever think of that Texas should bail out California. Impossible. But we do this without being a nation, and for all sorts of reasons. So the US, I think, is an excellent example of how we should have organized our euro. We should not have torn down the firewall in May 2010. That was the fundamental and the biggest mistake made. Many other mistakes were made before, as I said.
Time for one last question, gentleman at the back.
Yes. Continuing on the issue of the United States, if you look at the beginning of their union, the question of debt assumption, as they call it, was also asked, because the individual states had individual debts contracted during the Revolutionary Wars. And at that time, the federal state was a very large discussion, very acid discussion between proposals of a common central bank or no common central bank. But in the end, the argument was the federal state will assume the individual debt of the states, but in exchange, the individual states are not allowed to borrow. And if you look at individual constitutions of each of the 50 states, the vast majority of them, one article says you're not allowed to borrow. So the solution to this debt crisis today would not be to say we can assume part of the individual state debt, but in exchange, no state can borrow in the future. And let's see what Greece will say to that, if they accept it, because we are offering to bail out Greece with nothing in exchange. That may be the problem.
Yes, so, okay, now I don't know the history of the United States so well as you do, obviously, but obviously some states in the United States have been able to borrow. Otherwise, the governor of California, Mr. Jerry Brown, after he took over from Schwarzenegger, wouldn't have had to fire 30,000 government servants, reduce the pension funds. And anyway, he can't go anywhere. He has to solve it himself. And by the way, this and then 2 or 3 other states is a big exception. We all know what happened in California. But let me, on this United States of Europe, say something else. Herr Schäuble has proposed, has proposed that in future, since we go to the United States of Europe, by the way, it's only the United States of the Eurozone. May I remind you of that? What a funny name for a country. He has suggested that in future we all could elect the president of Europe by the public. And the theory, the tactic behind that idea is objective is very obvious. They would like you and I to believe that a more Europe will avoid these questions, these problems of the past. They have nothing to do with this. This is a smokescreen. It is it's a trick. Now, we in Germany are not even allowed to elect our own president by the people, let alone our chancellor or our prime ministers of the 16 states. It's all done by the parties. And here comes this great politician and says, but the European president you can vote for. Now think about it. I thought about it and said, look, that means we have in a German talk show sort of a Portuguese candidate, a Finnish candidate, a French candidate, and maybe a German candidate, and they would have to make their case with simultaneous translation. And we'll have to go to the marketplaces, and what a crazy idea. We have 23 languages in the 27 countries. This is not the United States where everybody speaks English. This is different. And the best, I always win the argument when I tell my football crazy Germans, okay, then we give up the German national football team and have a European team. And then the discussion is over.
I'm afraid we are out of time. I'll invite Dick and Ethan to pass the vote to them.
Well, Mr. Henkel, I would like to thank you very much for your thought-provoking words. These are words that should sound in the plenary hall of the European Parliament, but there, unfortunately, the only thing we hear is that the solution is more Europe, not less. And all the groups are, except ours, are saying this. And if you talk about the Europeans and the European flag, there's basically also a European dream, and which is derived from the French dream. François Hollande has written a book, as he wants to become president of the Republic, called Le Rêve Français, the French dream. And it took him about 150 pages to describe it. Whereas you can actually describe it in a few words, which is very easy, le beurre et l'argent du beurre. It's the butter and the money for the butter, or to have the cake and eat it. And we will now find out that this will be impossible, but it is also the European dream, it's not only the French dream. And we try to keep the euro, to keep this dream alive. But in fact, many European leaders at the moment, as they will arrive here tomorrow, will be daydreaming like many members of the European Parliament are. And I thank you for your reality check that you came to give here in Brussels. That is what we need more rather than less. And so I may invite you for a reception that we have in the hall of the hotel. Thank you all for coming, and see you next time.